And a good morning or a good afternoon or a good evening to you, depending on where you're viewing this from. Thank you very much for joining us. This is a webinar sponsored by Io-Tahoe. The topic today is GDPR, data discovery and machine learning. You won't believe what happens next. I'm Steve Friedberg. I'm your host for this afternoon. We are joined by the Managing Research Director for Enterprise Management Associates, John Meyers. John's been with EMA now for more than 6 years, and I consider him not only to be an expert in this field, but he's also a pretty good friend. John, good afternoon.
Thank you very much, sir. It's great to be here.
Good to have you here. Hey, real quickly, you have a presentation. We're going to talk about a number of things. Depending on what happens during this hour together, some folks may have questions. They may type them to us. We'll go over that in just a second. With your permission, I'll interrupt and fire some questions at you at key points to get your take on what they're saying, if that's okay?
That sounds fantastic. I'm looking forward to the interaction with the audience we have gathering right now.
Sounds good. All righty, I'm going to go on mute. So, John, at this point, this is yours.
Oh, fantastic. As Steve was talking about, we have a presentation today. If anybody has a question, they can log it in the chat window on their screen. Just drop that in there, send it to our producer, Andrew Brust, and he'll take care of that and get it to the questions in the right places. If you want to join the conversation via Twitter, whether it be live here today or as a recording, you can do so. Reach out to me at John L. Myers 44. Io-Tahoe's at Io-Tahoe. Steve is at MMI.com, and we're going to be looking at the data discovery hashtag today. But if you do have any questions or if you view this on the on-demand portion, we'll be monitoring that, and we'll reach back out and answer any questions that you may have. So a little bit about the agenda that we have going on today. I want to talk a little bit about how GDPR will make organizations ready for data-driven strategies in the future. I think GDPR is a big part of a couple of really key things that are happening in the world today. And while a lot of people are using GDPR as kind of the scary boogeyman part of things, I think it's got some great opportunities for benefits. And along those lines, looking at how some of our traditional best practices are challenges to being used in a strategic way. A little bit about kind of the forest for the trees concept. We're going to look at how automated techniques allow existing data management teams to really scale up and meet some of these challenges that we're looking at, and how AI and ML techniques can take data management from where we are today, kind of tactical, burgeoning on strategic, and really get up into areas where we can grab a hold of these wide data landscapes that we have. And then at the end, we're going to have a little bit of question and answer depending on the questions that come in via Twitter, through the chat window, et cetera. But tell you a little bit about what we're doing. So first question, how will GDPR make organizations more ready for data-driven strategies in the future? I think there are some great opportunities from compliance. At the moment, we have, like I said, the big bad GDPR, which is going to be put into effect on May 25th. So we're looking at about, I think, 17 days until it goes into effect. But we have lots of other compliance regulation types of activities that are out there. For those of us here in the United States, the HIPAA compliance for portability and accountability for privacy around electronic health medical records, that has got some opportunities there for compliance. I know that I've read some articles recently that say that the implementation of electronic health medical records, it makes life more difficult and more expensive for the average medical firm. But in my mind, enabling people to move from paper-based health medical records to electronic health medical records has two values. One, we move out of a kind of a paper process. And two, as we're able to put those things into an electronic format, it gives us that opportunity to get so much more data or information, if you will, about not an individual person who may have their records, but maybe we can get some researchers who get together and start to look at multiple different components. So it really does give that opportunity, like I said, here in the United States around HIPAA compliance. Sarbanes-Oxley, which is a little bit older than either HIPAA or GDPR, definitely gives organizations that ability to look at how they want to report to the government and how they need to do that. I think as people who look at that as a necessary evil, they spend a lot of manual time managing these particular components. But what they don't do is if they grab a hold of that and say, hey, if this is going to be a requirement for for our regulatory reporting, let's make that part of our regular processes. Let's use that information for our benefits and say, and rather than look at it as a necessary evil, let's make it a part of the way that we're going to be running our business. And then another one, Basel III financial regulation, again, looking at these as being, something that we have to do, much like the way that I look at sit-ups. There are things that I need to do or have to do, but if you don't embrace it, if you don't really grab a hold of it, you'll have these issues that happen in those areas. But I think that there are opportunities in these compliance pieces for us to gain operational excellence. So, for example, some of the key components of GDPR, from my humble opinion, that I really like as part of it, the data protection officer. Having somebody who's duly designated within your organization to say, I am responsible for the protection of the data in my particular organization. In my mind, that's a great idea because that starts to talk about, rather than it be an assumed responsibility, it really becomes something that's more important in what we're doing. The right of access, being able to say, hey, I want to be able to see where my information is within your organization. Again, if we are trying to meet the needs of our customers, and in a lot of organizations, the most important concept within the organization is the data about customers and some of their behaviors and things of that nature, whether it be spending habits, things of that nature. That's a valuable resource for us to be able to manage. And our users, if they feel comfortable that we have that information, we have it in a particular area, they're going to feel more comfortable about providing us with information. Some may decide to leave, but if we don't protect that information or give them that ability to take a look at it, then we have a slightly different thing where they're kind of going, I don't know, and then we start to lose trust. Another area I like is pseudonymization, or that right to be anonymized from the data that comes along with GDPR compliance. One of the things I like about that is that, when a customer, a supplier, a partner that's based out of the EU makes this request to say, hey, I feel uncomfortable about the way that you're using my data, the regulation doesn't say that I delete the information. It says that I need to make it so that I have anonymized or pseudonymized the data to the point that we can't really find out who the person is anymore. And I like that from an operational perspective, because if I have a lot of transactions and I need to know how many customers that I've had, how to link those to a particular piece, I can still keep the core of what my business is doing in terms of whether it be my analytical components, whether it be my operational use cases, things of that nature. I can still keep those all together. I just need to make sure that I can anonymize that data and do that. And the other thing I think is important out of GDPR is that data protection should be by design and by default. So to a certain extent, I would say that this is a good business practice that we should have, because I do believe that, to a certain extent, sometimes when we deal with the data about our organization or the data that we have about our customers, I'm not saying we play fast and loose with it, but we don't necessarily say we want to have data protection be in our design and be set up by default to say these are the things that we want to have happen, that if all else fails, we're going to go to this level of protection. So in my opinion, these are four of the core things that really are key to making, getting some good value out of GDPR. For example, if we have proactive compliance, we're going to spur some great opportunities for strategic growth. For example, the data protection officer, an individual who is identified within the company whose part of their responsibilities is the understanding and protection of the data associated with that. Well, to my ear, that sounds a lot like what should be at least in the top 3 to 5 lines of the job description of our chief data officer, that individual who's at the strategic level within the organization, who looks at data as a strategic asset and allows it to be managed in that way. So while some organizations might go, all right, tag, you get to be the data protection officer, in my opinion, that should be embraced. That should be addressed by saying this data protection officer role is going to be part of our CDO or our CDO's organization. And as part of that, we now are going to embrace that as a strategic part of the way that we want to go. And again, if we go to that data protection by design and by default, this really rolls into that particular component to say our chief data officer is going to help us to manage that part down. The next component is that right of access. If one of our customers, partners, suppliers from the EU wants to know where their personal data is, I think that's a great thing. But if we don't have a complete data catalog of the information that we have within our organization, how can we provide that right of access to say this is where you can go see that information? Because one of the keys is, unfortunately, it's a phrase or it's a saying that's kind of gone out of style, but I really like it. The things you know, which I would say is if you have a complete data catalog, is quite interesting. The things you don't know, you might go, hey, I don't know where all this personal data is, but if I have a catalog and can start to go looking around in it, but if I have the things I don't know, that's where the regulatory compliance fines from the EU around GDPR is really going to start to bite people. And if there are those things we don't know, that's the risk. That's what's going to get our legal teams, our risk and compliance officers a little nervous at night. But if we start to develop a complete data catalog of our entire data landscape, it will allow us to be able to not only make this request of right to access, but it will allow us to understand so much more about our data landscape and how and where information resides and works together. So this is 2 areas, like I said, where they're listed as compliance. You can just do them like begrudgingly, but if you embrace them, they'll provide you with whole new opportunities for strategic growth.
So, John, let me interrupt you just for 1 second. Checking on news.google.com today, there's a lot of frightening stories coming out about GDPR just being around the corner. For example, here's one headline, Unroll.me to delete EU accounts before the deadline. Or another one, lies, damn lies in GDPR. Overall, it seems like a lot of people are assuming the worst. What I hear you say is, if you want to take it from that perspective, that's fine, but it can actually be a benefit if you take a look at it in the right way.
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm trying to say. And I fully assume that we will see, as to that first headline you were describing, we will see risk and legal teams in the United States or other parts of the world that aren't necessarily directly inside of the EU look at the situation and go, you know what, it is easier and cheaper for me to excise my European customers, partners, and suppliers than it is for me to comply with the law or comply with the EU regulations. And that is, it can boil down to a cost-benefit analysis. And I'm not saying they're wrong and they're doing that, but it seems to me to be fairly short-sighted to excise myself of a group of customers, or have a kind of a barrier to European customer suppliers and other entities to doing business with me because I am fearful of or not embracing of the compliance. In terms of the other one, lies, damn lies, and things said about GDPR. I think there's a certain amount of Y2K, and probably some people on the line might go Y2K. I was there at the beginning. When we were doing Y2K, we were all so afraid that the systems weren't going to work. As of 12:01 a.m. in the year 2000, that there was this big boogeyman, and it wasn't going to move. We couldn't change the clock. We didn't do that. But we went through all our checks. We made sure we could handle the changeover from 2 digits to 4 digits in our calendar. And for the most part, the world kept spinning, and there wasn't any problems with that. And I think that there are some organizations that are using GDPR as a driver to affect change. I do believe the EU Commission, they fully expect this to cause a certain amount of disruption. But it depends on how do you want to manage it. Do you want to excise yourself or limit yourself from EU participation, or do you want to embrace it, and do you want to say, yes, we want to make ourselves better and, and bring some of these things together? Again, maybe my sit-ups example is a little, if you will, naive or simplistic, but I don't like doing sit-ups, but I know that they provide me with value, so I embrace them and I do them the way I'm supposed to. So, all right. So, challenges that our traditional best practices pose to strategic data management. So, when I talk about best practices around data management, I oftentimes like to look at them between our strategic goals, or if you will, the best patterns that we're trying to achieve versus the tactical activities that we have in terms of the best practices that we're trying to do. So, for example, if you recognize the automobile on the right-hand side of the screen, you probably would have heard at one point in time the rule of thumb, every 3,000 miles or every 3 months you want to change your oil in that vehicle. And that was a best practice. I don't know if that was invented by guys who wanted to sell motor oil to people, but, it seemed to work pretty well. I know it gets stretched a little with my more modern vehicle. I think I get to do every 7,500 miles, but, there was always that watchword of every 3 months or 3,000 miles, you should change the oil in your car. Well, as I was driving down the road the other day, and my 14-year-old daughter asked me, well, what about this car? It's the Tesla 3 that's on the screen right now. How do you use that best practice of change the motor oil every 3 months or every 3,000 miles for a vehicle that really, other than lubrication of the drivetrain, doesn't use motor oil to lubricate the engine? So that particular best practice of doing that is not applicable to a new environment, a new way of doing things. But the best pattern of making sure that we identify the key component that we're trying to make sure we're providing the right care and feeding of, we can do that. So maybe for the Tesla, we will change that from, change your oil every 3,000 miles to make sure that you have the drive components lubricated every 3,000 miles, and to make sure that the motors are going to do that type of thing. But we can't just take that traditional best practice and apply it to a lot of these new venues. We want to take those patterns, but not necessarily the practices. Now, if we take a look at what we have here in some of our traditional data stores, we have ERP, CRM, supply chain, human resource management, et cetera. And we've developed best practices associated with those environments around data quality, mastering domains, semantic definitions. In terms of ERP, we're looking at transactions that go through the system to say, from either our point of sale or from our ordering systems, how do we look at those individual transactions as they come through the system? In terms of CRM, how do we look at the data quality associated with our customers, whether they business or consumer? How do we address those particular components? And, for example, if we look at some of the major tier 1 wireless companies in the United States, we're looking at about anywhere between 90 to 110 million subscribers in those particular areas. And that, that's kind of pushing the outer limits of some of the things that we want to do with that. But we can take on that data quality challenge. Mastering domains around our products, looking at that, we can now go down and take a look at those things and look at our product catalogs and bring that information together. And in terms of semantic definitions, whether it be for a business or region, if we look at it from an HR perspective, looking at it from a job, we can now bring those semantic definitions. And we have these best practices that we've developed over the last 20, 30 years. And I think they're all good tactical ways of looking at things, but there are components of it where we're kind of like, can we take these practices and move them on to the new data management field that we have in the future? So a little bit different, some of the new data sets that I think are going to augment, not replace, but augment the data sets that we have above. You look at geolocation data. Do we really have a particular piece of data quality that we need to fix, lat long types of things? Now, if we misapply them, then yes, definitely we need to do a data quality, and probably some of those best practices, those tactical best practices will apply. But to a certain extent, if we apply a lat long position on the planet, it is where it is. It's not really a change of things of that nature. And we're starting to see a lot of that type of geolocation information come from smartphones, come from connected vehicles, things of that nature. We start to take a look at log file information from mobile apps, or we look at clickstream information from online applications and things of that nature. We start to get away from the end goal of a transaction, and we start to look at all the steps that lead up to that particular transaction. So imagine, if you will, we are looking at, rather than the point of sale information from a major consumer packaged goods store, we start looking at the information on their website or on their mobile app. We're starting to ingest information about each of the things that they looked at as they went down the path of possibly putting something into a shopping cart, whether they put something in, whether they took something out, what are the things that they're looking at, and possibly more importantly than identifying the path that somebody took to make a purchase is understanding the paths that people that led them to abandon a particular purchase. Was it that they found that they left our site to go to a competitor's? Is it that they didn't like the pricing? All of this type of information, this kind of behavioral type of information is really expanding the way that we're taking a look at it. And if we look at the semantic definition for some of those concepts, how do we really take the best practices of tactical pieces where we may have just been looking at transaction, order, et cetera, and how do we address that for this new level of fine-grained detail that we have access to? And the social media also gives us another one. If we look at that in terms of either of or any of these things, data quality, mastering domains, et cetera, how do we take a look at that, and how do we really gain the new interest that we want to do? If we're looking at the number of tweets or the Facebook posts or things of that nature, we're looking at a lot more information than we ever have before. And there are some new ways of looking at it. So, for example, when I'm not particularly thrilled with one of my suppliers, when I am out and about traveling, oftentimes I may tweet about it and say, this was an epic fail, or great job with a kind of a crooked smiley face on it. But these types of things, they don't really fit into, say, a data quality. Oh, we spelled epic fail wrong, let's replace that. No, that is the sentiment of a particular person, and we need to be able to interpret it, not correct it, if you will. So much more of an augmentation at that particular point. But in these areas, it's hard for us to take those traditional best practices and apply them to these new data sets. We need to take the patterns and say, what were our goals, and find out new tactical ways of addressing those particular components.
John, let me bring up something of a sidebar at this point. You talk about all the data that's going to be generated from smartphones and devices such as that. This is where we get into the question of edge computing. And a lot of people have been talking about that. You really can't go more than 5 minutes without hearing somebody in the tech sector speaking about it. So if you assume that these data sets will continue to grow, that they're going to continue to be generated, consumed at the edge, at the expense, will it be at the expense of a traditional data center and even cloud computing sites? And does data discovery grow in importance in parallel with edge computing with all of this data that's coming out?
Well, you raise a good issue. You know, if we push things out to the edge, our data landscape now goes from maybe 30 years ago or 20 years ago to a data center that we could see, touch, feel, have control over, to every smartphone of every customer or prospect that we've thought of. And that's kind of a daunting piece to take a look at. And edge computing does give, or edge processing gives us that opportunity to give a real-time or as close to real-time advantage over some of the data that we're taking a look at. But to a certain extent, I don't think it's going to challenge or break that model, because to a little bit of it, a lot of these things, the geolocation, the log files from mobile apps, social media components, things of that nature, that will, if I do edge computing about, you know, John Meyers and his smartphone or what he's doing with his apps, how do I truly understand how John ranks amongst other people? Because we're not going to give John's smartphone access to data from, you know, personalized data or fine-grained data from people who are around him. That kind of goes against our Gdpr data protection by design and by default. And it also means that if I want to do historical analysis on that, I may not be able to keep all the information about John on his smartphone, even though, you know, while I don't have one, I have been lusting over a 256 gigabyte smartphone, which is really shocks me that I'd be able to carry almost a terabyte in my pocket as I'm walking around. But those particular components are going to require us to have some centralized data stores, whether that be at a cloud location where we can bring that all together, or whether we decide we want to have that inside of a private cloud within our data center. I think it will augment, much like we're talking about some of the different components. We're going to have our best patterns that we're going to want to address to say, hey, how can I push out an algorithm that would best identify the things that John wants to do, much like we may have pushed that out to a point of sale or to a call center in previous eras. We can now push that out to the edge. But when we look at the data about John and about the others, so that we can say, is John an individual, or is he part of a wider bucket, or all these different things, we're going to need to be able to coalesce that information at different points. The edge only gives you visibility and processing of those things that connect to it. You probably have a midpoint that might say, all right, let's look at all the people in a particular geography or a particular factory. If we're talking about, different components, to say, hey, let's look at where we are on a campus, and then we want to bring it back to a center where we can look across all of these data points and say, this is how this all fits together and how we can make an algorithm that would benefit John at the edge. Okay. So a lot of this is leading us down this path about automated techniques and how we can use that to scale our existing data management teams. If we start to say, hey, how do we look at these previous best practices or best patterns, and how can we start to do that as our landscape leaves that data center that we used to be able to see, touch, feel to a certain extent? I always kind of laugh. I was doing a class yesterday where I was talking about, hey, every once in a while I want to make sure that I can go knock on the housing of a particular data set, but, you know, that's, you know, with the advent of both cloud providers and other components, I may not be able to do that much anymore. So I like to point out a lot of times that manual artistry doesn't scale very well. So, for example, the young man on the left-hand side of the screen is a fairly iconic statue, and it took Michelangelo 2 years to craft the statue of David, to go all the way from the selection of stone to the design to the implementation and to the statue that we know today. Now, for the most part, that's a work of art. That was 2 years well spent. I can put just the picture of that up in front of many of the classes that I teach or some of the presentations that I do, and I haven't met a room yet where people don't go, that's David. Now, the problem is that a lot of times when we build an analytical environment, we have the same type of time frame. You know, there was a rule of thumb that I used to hear quite a bit was your average data warehouse or analytic environment repository took 2 years to make, took $2 million for budget, but yet 50% of them failed. A lot of it was because it took 2 years to go from requirements to implementation, and a lot of times that wasn't doing what we wanted to do. It was, you know, that type of level of manual artistry really isn't going to go work for us. So how do we go from our ability to manage, govern, understand the information in a relatively small number of operational and analytical systems to getting to the wider component of our data landscape, to be able to understand that as we bring in distributed data from not just around a particular geography, but around the globe, including cloud data sets, new formats, and things of that nature. So not just looking at relational sources, but looking at Hadoop and other types of sources as well. How do we bring that all together? And in my humble opinion, the way to do that is through automation and monitoring, to say, let me get an automated discovery tool that will allow me to go through, and rather than me trying to do everything myself as a data management professional, whether that be DBA, steward, data modeler, et cetera, allow those discovery tools to go out and, pardon me for saying it this way, but spider or spelunk through table spaces, file systems, et cetera, bring me back the information in a format that I can easily digest, and then make that an automated process so that I can look at comparison of one day to the next. This is a good example of where we look at in terms of, you know, compliance. You look at the Dodd-Frank regulation, again, here in the United States, and there are some interesting ways that financial services corporations have to do a load testing. And if they don't embrace it, it takes a lot of manpower, effort, and you know, consternation to do a financial load test. They have to do it on a regular basis, and I think a lot of organizations that don't embrace it look at it as this problem, and it takes them a long time. If you automate that process and make it as smooth and operational as possible, you can get the results of a load test whenever you want by simply hitting the button and getting your answer. Automation gives you that same ability to be able to say, if we embrace this catalog of information, truly understanding where we are in terms of our data landscape, we can now take that information, we can automate it, we can bring it to within our environment, and then we can check between one to the other to say, hey, these are the new data sets that have come together. If we look at it from a GDPR perspective, if we're able to automate that and go, look, we have new personally identifiable information. We now know the things that we didn't know before. Hey, we have new data. Let's go investigate it. Does it count as part of the personally identifiable information as part of customer product supplier or customer partner supplier? If it does, let's make sure we manage it the way that we would otherwise. And now we're being very proactive as we see these things pop up. But if we don't know that there are new data sets because we did a manual process, we're going to run into issues where that'll be that I don't know that I don't know. That leads to fear on part of the risk analysis teams or risk and compliance teams, and that leads to that headline that Steve, that you were quite frankly talking about. Rather than deal with it, let me excise my European contacts and just not do business with them anymore.
Which begs the question then, I think, John, that if you assume that data discovery is something that you do want to do, is there a point in a company's life cycle where transitioning from the manual approach to automated data discovery becomes, if you will, a must-have?
Well, I'm going to give a typical analyst, consultant / economist answer, and it depends. If you are an organization where you have relatively few platforms that you need to manage, so let's say you are Bob's Widgets out of Kansas City, and you have your Salesforce, you've got your cloud-based ERP system from NetSuite, you've got a couple of different components. You can possibly, with your team, manage that environment, and that's not really a problem. But if I am part of Bob's Widgets and I don't have full-time dedicated data management professionals, that, you know, we're in the business of making widgets, not necessarily the business of making data warehouses, we can use automation to augment our staff and to give us that information that we're looking for much easier than we could if we tried to do it manually or just ignore the problems altogether. But you ask, when is that inflection point? I would say that it's when an organization looks at their IT support group or their IT data management teams, and they're not able to support the load that they have in their organization, or they would like to move from tactical approaches to strategic goals. And, you know, while we can't talk about that, those sound like great, wonderful buzzwords, until somebody makes that decision that we want to get out of the, you know, the tree or the leaf side of our business and get into the tree or the forest side of our business, we run into those issues. Okay. Another thing I think that goes very hand in glove with the automation side is the value of AI and ML, and how can we take our data management to the next level. So I hate to say this, you know, I wouldn't say I'm quite a television binge guy, but I like to watch my fair of TV. Two of my favorite shows out there are House and the show Billions on Showtime. And, you know, two of the things that I think that what we wish we could do is, rather than have the expertise of our two main characters, Dr. House and Bobby Axelrod, locked within their heads, is to be able to say, how can we scale the information that these characters have, their attributes, their ability to diagnose things, and how do we move that up to the next level? So in relation to Showtime, or the Billions show on Showtime, there's a whole little mini arc within the show about how can they take and use quants and analytic algorithms to replicate the things that Bobby Axelrod could see when he needs to be able to do trades. And they're talking about that. In terms of House, there's always this big thing about telemedicine. How can we use the knowledge base of some of our best and brightest healthcare professionals, and how can we put that into an algorithm that will not replace them, but to augment them. A lot of times I hear from, well, in particular, doctors who go, no black box will replace me. And to a certain extent, when we talk about this scaling, we're not saying, I want to replace you. Rather than having you try to think of all of the medications on the planet that a particular patient might need, how can we look at the information about the patient through these electronic health medical records and say, you know, for example, John Meyers is allergic to to a product called naproxen. And if he's allergic to it, let's take that off the list, but not have to make our physicians or our telemedicine guys so focused on, hey, tell me about all your allergies, but use the existing information that we already have to say, let me give you 3 to 5 choices, and you as the doctor can make that choice. Or if we get good enough at it, we can use those algorithms to promote information that way. So, but that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to scale with the information that we have, take that institutional knowledge that exists within our really, really smart guys and see, can we move it out into new areas? So in terms of data management, what am I talking about? So up here, I have 2 of my favorites. On the top left, I have, you know, kind of our typical data management, data modeler type guy. And on our bottom right, I have our typical data steward, the person who knows both the data and the business, and how do we help them move from A to B. In terms of my data modeler, my schema expert, my technical guy, how can I help to say the skills and abilities that they have to recognize links between data, whether it be particular aspects, how do we put that into an AI and ML type of situation where I'm not trying to replace him, but I'm trying to say, of the designs, the links, the things of that nature that are very tactical in nature, how do we raise that up, allow the machine to give recommendations to say, hey, we've seen ways that this data could be worked together. Would you like us to make that link? Would you like to do that type of thing? Again, this allows us to scale this person so they can tackle more and exciting jobs than have them go down a path where we're trying to replace them. And likewise with our business analyst or our steward, how do we take the information that exists in a lot of our frontline employees around data quality, semantic definitions, things of that nature, and how do we allow these systems to be able to let them help make decisions and scale out across all of these folks, as opposed to our more traditional way of doing it, is saying, hey, you're our data steward, you get to have this fun and exciting job on top of your day job, and you get to go down that particular path and have that work out for you. All right, so how do we do that? When we had a relatively small environment, we could do this like we were just talking about at a relative scale. But as we move to that data catalog size, how do we get this to really go from point A to point B? And the key is to take AI and ML and put that in the middle and say, as I am bringing together the metadata from my data catalog automation process and bring that over from discovery, how do I go through and look at all this metadata, look at all the profiling information associated with this, and how do I say, make those recommendations to my modelers, to my data stewards, and say, I just found new information over here that looks very similar to what we have over here. It doesn't have the same entity name, so it's not like trying to match on customer table, cus table, or address line, address one. We're saying, looking in the actual data itself, being able to go, hey, we found information that looks very much like customer names. The table's got a weird, or the files have a weird name on it, but we found the stuff that looks very much like the information we have over here in our personally identifiable collection. Would you like to further investigate? Would you like to be able to make that work? and for our data stewards as well. If they can give inputs into the system, into the data catalog, and us to be able to use that to train and develop the models, we'll be able to present back to them saying, hey, here's some new pieces of information. Would you like to use this as part of what you're trying to do? But in those cases, we're taking that AI and that ML, looking at and investigating the metadata within our auto-discovered or data discovery catalog and bringing that out and saying, how do we make this much more strategic in the way that we run our business? So in terms of our next steps.
John,
sorry, Steve.
John,
go ahead.
No, that's okay. You're bringing up the terms AI and ML, and everybody else is. It's to the point where we run the risk, I think, of having it mean so much to so many that it ends up being nothing to anybody, becoming this year's buzzcronym, if you will. So what steps should I, if I'm a company, be taking to ensure that if I move in that direction of implementing an AI or an ML strategy when it comes to my data, then I'm just not moving blindly ahead? I mean, what should I be demanding, for example, from vendors? What should I be saying, you guys need to be able to prove this before I buy?
Okay. Well, there's two ways to look at machine learning and AI. Well, the first thing is to understand that machine learning is the algorithms that pull this stuff out, and AI is the, if you will, the workflow or the decisioning that allows us to do particular tasks. So I look at it as kind of the, the learning part is in the ML, and the action part is in the artificial intelligence side. But a lot of people have pushed those together because what's the point of having a machine learning algorithm if you don't have any action that goes with it, and you need the algorithm to feed the actions that come from that. Now, the way I look at things, there's in our current data management space, there's two versions of AI and ML. One is the outbound side, where I am looking at, say, customer data and or transactional data, trying to say, hey, how can I do the next best purchase? How do I do that thing where I can look at John's behavior from his smartphone and go, hey, John, you're coming up on, for lack of a better word, my local home improvement store. We know that this time of year you like to buy mulch. Would you like to go buy a couple of bags of mulch so you can put it in your yard? That would be awesome. That'd be fantastic. And that's kind of like the anything is possible type of use cases where we got a lot of wide open stuff, a lot of, as you said, that acronym bloat. I think we're substituting the words advanced analytics or machine learning for advanced analytics, just as we move from predictive analytics to advanced analytics. We're now at machine learning. They're slightly different concepts that we're looking at. In this particular context about what we're talking about here on screen is to say, let's point that not outbound at cross-sell, upsell, but how do we point that inbound at this not discrete, but this relatively well-formed metadata collection in our enterprise data catalog through smart discovery, and then allow that to be used to find those patterns that we can identify. I've looked at a lot of the machine learning algorithms that people can use, and a lot of these things are existing algorithms, things that we've used to identify populations in natural ecosystems, to say, hey, if I'm trying to compare two jungles and decide if they are the same type of environment, if I see one tiger in one and I see 10 in another, I've got matching because they both have tigers, but I have a significantly larger number of tigers in this other environment than I have over here. Are these the same type of thing? So these are kind of some tried and true algorithms. We're seeing some new stuff, but what you really need to have is from your vendors, to your point, is if someone goes, what is this doing? What is this AI and what is this ML? Have them explain it. If they can't explain the high parts, not the math part of it, which I think is sometimes fruitless when people say, hey, walk me through the math of a machine learning algorithm, but walk me through what this is trying to do, this high-level goal that it's supposed to accomplish, and see if it separates from just merely doing one activity and trying to do several others. But that's where I would say that. But I like this area because it's a little bit more contained, it's a little bit more controlled, and it's what I would call the what's probable side as opposed to anything is possible on that outbound side as opposed to looking within. Okay. All right. And some of our next steps are the kind of our conclusion here. In my opinion, GDPR is really going to drive data-driven readiness for those proactive and ready-to-go organizations. So if you're just learning about GDPR in this webinar, and I'm telling you that we're here on May 8th, and you are going, wait a minute, this is going to be going on the 25th, you still have opportunities to make sure you can get a hold of this. But if you're fearful of it, it's going to limit your opportunities long term. If you embrace it and try to manage the risk as opposed to avoiding the risk, you'll be able to do some great things. I think that automation will drive our coverage of our expanded data landscape so that we can truly understand where all of these data elements are, not just the personally identifiable pieces that are required for GDPR compliance. And if we apply smart AI and ML techniques, we'll be able to increase the scale so that we don't have to hire an army of data stewards to tackle this particular problem. We can have good, smart, internal resources that allow us to manage our environments the way we would like. Have that CDO, have their team of strategic data stewards really bring this stuff up. So, you know, again, we're going to drop into the Q&A portion of our conversation here. If you'd like to join the conversation via Twitter, again, we have the handles up here. I'm at John L. Meyers 44. Io-Tahoe's at Io-Tahoe. Steve is at MMICom. And then if you put the data discovery hashtag on there, which I believe is at the underpinning of everything we've talked about today, we'll get back to you via that. But just to see if we have any other questions that are out there, Steve, I'll let you manage the queue.
Well, we'll go into one, and before we get to the question, obviously you see that, John, you have authored an impact brief specifically about Io-Tahoe here, announcing the new data discovery and catalog platform. That is a new report out within the last several weeks, I believe. Mm-hmm. And there is a link there if you're interested in downloading it. We'd be delighted to hear from you on it. Specifically regarding Io-Tahoe's data catalog, is this just the tip of the iceberg with machine learning when it comes to data? And if not, what's next? Where should we be looking about what's coming down the road?
Well, your point about, what's the, is this acronym abuse? I definitely think that having enough data for machine learning algorithms to learn what they want to learn, those are the components that you have to go through to make that a reality. The more data that we put into our data catalogs through concepts like automated discovery are really going to enable that first foundation of what we want to do. Once we have that foundation, we'll be able to go into, really neat and cool ways of looking at this data. So, I gave the example of looking at different data populations to try to find links or common elements. You can do fuzzy pattern matching and other types of things to do to say, hey, how do we look at all of the information that might be in our data warehouse, our enterprise applications like ERP or CRM, and our Hadoop and NoSQL platforms, and bring that together and say, I can now link files from Hadoop with information from my enterprise resource planning platform and bring that together and not have it be, I have to know all the intricacies of all those systems. The AI and the ML will surface that to our management professionals, and they can start to move down that path.
And on that note, we promised you about an hour's worth of time. We're coming right up on it. So, John Meyers from EMA, Enterprise Management Associates, I want to thank you very much for taking the hour to be with us. Folks, I want to thank you for joining us for this webinar. Again, take a look at the screen if you'd like to download the EMA impact brief about Io-Tahoe's data platform. We'd be delighted to have you do so. So in the meantime, have yourself a good day, and we'll talk to you soon.